Okay, you got it.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. So
Yeah.
I guess we'll just jump into it. So I'm here with Professor Wendy Smith. She's a full professor at University of Delaware, and she studies paradoxes. And we're just here to chat and have some fun.
Thank you for inviting me into this conversation.
Yeah, this is really fun. So, can you begin with but most of the audience is researchers, but there's a lot of people that are thinking of going into research, a lot of undergraduate students, I believe, and even high school students. Can you tell me how you started? Where did all of this come from, this desire to be a researcher? That seems strange to me.
David, I did not want to be a researcher.
I love it. I love it.
I'll just start there.
Okay, good. No, I love it. I love it. I love these stories. It's really interesting. So why? What happened?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
tell me. So what happened in high school? Was there, let's start there. Let's go all the way back. And I want to hear your story of,
Yeah.
how did you get to where you are today? And you're leading, you're one of the leading scholars. You're leading a lot at your institution, as well as uh, associate editors at major journals, like doing all this crazy stuff, right? How did you go from high school student to where you are today?
Oh, well, thank you for the invitation to reflect. I mean, so it is true. I have found a space in academia that I absolutely love and love the research that I do and love the work that I get to do and the scholarship, love the ideas and also love the impact of the ideas. And I guess by way of background, I entered into this world. In part I study paradox, and in part I study it, as they say, at least in the field of psychology, and that research is me search. And I study paradoxes because I really lived into the opposite, the very either or when it came to my own career decisions. And for me, the either or was the tension between being out in the world as what we academics call the real people who really are doing to make impact, and those of us that are in academia behind the ivory towers that are thinking about ways that people make impact. And I struggled with that as an either or career decision for a very long time because, to your point about high school, when I was in high school, I was very involved in a youth group. I was very involved to the
Well,
extent
love it.
that I took off my first year of college to become the international president of this youth group. I have a direct line of thought that goes from what I teach today around leadership, organizational behavior, managing people, thinking about decision-making strategy, straight to the things that I learned in high school in that leadership in that youth group. I was leading 20,000 kids around the world when I was 18. I was traveling around the world. So I really valued the skills that I brought to the table as a leader, as somebody who could identify opportunities and make them happen. And I did not, necessarily understand or value the skills that I could bring to the table as somebody who studied and engaged in understanding those pieces. And I struggled as a researcher or asking myself why, why I wasn't sure if I was going to get, I really loved the idea of ideas. I loved ideas, but I struggled with, why am I getting a PhD if what I want to be doing is having an impact on the world? And I guess what I would say is I study paradox. I study living into competing ideas and thinking about their integration. And as a career path, I live that because now I see so profoundly the possibility of generating valuable ideas that are generated from the real problems people have, and that can go back and help inform and impact people in those challenges that they experience. And I'm so grateful to be able to be part of that overall integrative process.
No, that's super cool. So I was just thinking, and for those, there's going to be a large audience. my mom listens to this, to like, a lot of people who's she's in her 80s, and she wouldn't quite know some of these things. It seems like really strange that you went from a youth group, right? So I'm assuming that was in a religious organization, to being, you know, corporate and going and becoming, this sort of enemy, I guess. How do you reconcile this? This in of itself is a little bit of a paradox, I guess, or maybe that this was a linear path that you've taken.
Yeah. Well, hi, Mom. You should be proud of your son. So glad she's out there listening. Um, and again, I mean, I really do live and believe deeply the theory that I study. So for some people, they study ideas and they're very divorced from the experiences they have in life. That's not true for me. I study the question of how it is that our lives can be segmented into these or how the world is segmented into these opposing, conflicting experiences. And if we take a deeper look at them and sort of unfold the direct conflicts, we can see the ways they are interdependent with one another. And we've just, and I study this at the level of, what is it like for an organization to think about who they are in the current world, their existing world, and who they are in the future, and the tension between, the stability of their current operations and the change into their novel places. Or I study it in the realm of sustainability and social responsibility, and the question of the tension that corporations and individuals also feel between profits, managing for their financial future, but also thinking about the impact that they have on a broader range of people in terms of the planet and people, and how those come into conflict with each other. But yet, if we unfold and peel back, we could see that these, looking at these mechanistically and only seeing the distinctions, we miss the holistic interdependencies. And that's the invitation of the theory that I study. And so, which is pulling back from just seeing these things as either ors to exploring the more holistic both ands. Well, you've just asked, I think it's true. I mean, in the same way in our lives and how we segment our lives into these realms that are nonprofit and for-profit, when if you pull back, you can and government and and religious institutions and our friends in theory and our friends in the world of logics will talk about just how those have very different, the language is institutional logics, right? Many of your people listening will resonate with those, have very different logics associated with them. Like how we show up in our communities is very different from how we show up in our corporations, which is very different from politics. And yet you can also peel back each of these very different segmented things and ask, what are the ways in which each of these segments of society, our society runs on a holistic interdependency across these different realms? What does that look like? And so on one hand, we can put up the barriers to sort of between these different realms and see our identities in really different ways. And on the other hand, we can pull it back and say, okay, well, what are the ways in which I am a whole human being that represents multiple identities and integrates those into a way of impacting the world more broadly?
Yeah, how do we actually get here to where we have these very strong categories? Is that like something that always existed? Or is this something that's kind of part of modern civilization where we have many different identities? We try to separate those things as much. Like I would love for, I mean, maybe I could show you around, right? I'm sitting outside. Part of the reason I'm sitting outside is because I'm trying to separate my real work, from doing the reciprocity project and building this sort of platform thing. So is this something that's an artifact of the legal institutions that have evolved over the years? And then we sort of have this strong barriers or boundaries to sort of show other people that we're very professional or something along those lines. I don't know. What's your thoughts on this? How did this come to be?
How much time do we have?
I love it.
I gosh, sometimes they say I didn't have enough time to write you a short email. I don't have enough, like the question is how to succinctly answer that, because essentially what you're pointing to is how we have segmented our lives in so many different ways. And so I want to, I guess, say two pieces to that. The first is how we've gotten there, and the second is what we do about it. And I'll start with the second first, because to be clear, I think that there is value in these segmentations as long as they come along with the complex understanding of their connections. So when we in the paradox world talk about what it means to live into paradox, to live into the both and, to live more holistically, paradox scholars will point to one key set of practices that academically we'll talk about as differentiating and integrating, or more colloquially we'll talk about as separating and connecting. Finding ways that these opposing forces, you can pull them apart and they're distinct from one another, and finding ways that they connect with each other. Now, in the either or mode, what we do is we pull things apart. Am I focused on today or tomorrow? Am I focused on, my podcast world and being in a conversation, or am I focused on my research? Am I focused on, am I addressing an identity associated with, whatever, like with being a real person out there and a leader, or being a scholar? And the either or approach is to pull those apart, see the ways they're different, and then choose between them. And by the way, this is what we typically do in a conversation with somebody who has a different perspective, different political perspective, different point of view on the world. We pull them apart in service of like trying to, who's going to win that argument, and choosing. The both and approach is to say, let's pull these apart so we understand each of these perspectives. What does it mean to be a leader in the world? What does it mean to show up as a researcher? What does it mean to do the work of podcasting? What does it mean to do the work of scholarship? What does it mean for a company to think about its financial profit bottom line? What does it mean to think about, and how does it focus on its social mission? And then do that in service of not choosing or conflicting or finding a conflict and figuring out which is the right way, but instead in service of finding points of connection to make a broader holistic interdependency. So there's value in pulling these things apart. It's just, to what end? Do you stop there and choose, or do you use that in service of a more broader, holistic, complex conversation?
So two things. I actually I love this sort of practical view of things. So I'm curious in what was the moment where you started thinking about this? Because this seems very, very intense, very in depth. You know this very well. And then the other thing that I was thinking about on the sort of really macro side, I view today that we have become very polarized, and there's lots of, regardless, I think there's lots of discussion about the fact that we become polarized. How can we use the idea of paradoxes to resolve some of these inconsistencies that we have in sort of the polarized macro world? So, I would love to sort of hear those two ideas, the sort of micro side. What was because there's moments where all of a sudden you're like, okay, this is it, and then how can we actually use this or practically to change the world, I guess, or view the world differently in our own minds?
Your first question, what were the moments? There's probably such a handful of them along the way. Some of them have to do with growing up as a Canadian in America. Some of them have to do with having traveled abroad when I was a kid and seeing multiple different perspectives and wondering their interdependencies. Some of them have to do with when I started as a scholar, and the very first project I was working on was around innovation and looking at senior teams, and they were grappling with the tension between today and tomorrow, their innovation and their existing product, or what we in academia call, from March 1991, explore, exploit. And the teams that were doing this well were thinking about the interdependencies between these. And I was really in search of a broader theoretical perspective that could help me rethink how we think about these kinds of tensions. And, I'm grateful there was a small handful at the time of interesting thought leaders around this. There was a book by David Berg and Ken Wynne Smith, Paradoxes of Group Life. There was a book by Kim Cameron and Bob Quinn on paradox and transformation, but mostly there was a fantastic paper by my phenomenal, brilliant co-author now, Marianne Lewis, who boldly wrote a paper in 1999 about exploring paradox as a lens for organizational theory. And people weren't really talking about it that much. So I reached out to Marianne. And I like to say, although she always gives me a hard time for this, but I like to say I stalked my mentors, which was a phrase that came out of leadership guru Warren Bennis. I stalked my mentors, which is that I reached out to Marianne and I said, gosh, this seems really interesting. Can we sit down at the Academy of Management and you can tell me everything you know about this I need to know? And so, we like to say the rest is history because we sat down and we just had such a productive, generative, interesting conversation about this idea of paradox, contradictory yet interdependent elements that never get solved, how that informs our world, and where and how that can inform our thinking. And to fast forward to your second question, just this morning we were on the phone with one another because we live in an ongoing consternation, challenge, opportunity, whatever you want to call it, about just seeing how polarized we are as a world and wondering what this idea of paradox as a mindset, but also what are the competencies that people need to be able to be in conversation, to value and be in productive conversation with people that have a very different point of view than theirs, and recognize that actually they're working towards similar goals if they weren't just so polarized in how they and so conflictual and defensive in how they approach the conversation. And gosh, that would be my dream.
So what would be sort of practical things that you could take away? Like what are some key, I don't know if you have activities, I don't know if you've thought about that, like almost like what would you teach first graders and second graders? I know I was reading a little bit of your book, and I know that you're a parent and you deal with some of these inconsistencies all the time. How do you teach your kids to grapple with this very complicated world that we're entering into? So I think about this, as somebody that studies innovation, I often think like the world is glorious and we're really moving and solving a lot of problems, but at the same time, we create these massive problems like, climate change that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. And the only way that we can sort of address these issues is by going even further. So, pursuing innovation even further was probably going to get us even more of a mess. So, what are practical takeaway activities that you might tell somebody that's, 7, 8 years old, and how to address these big issues?
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you say 7 or 8 because I do think that's where we need to start. I think that when my kids were that age, people would say, oh, kids need black and white. They need clear thinking. And so that they can really understand the boundaries and the rules. And actually, we're finding that that's not true, that actually kids need to know that there is complexity in the world and that they can show up and they can bring a reflective, complex self, a curious, dynamic, growth-oriented, complex self to the problems that they face. That's actually quite profound. So I'm glad that you're even bringing us back to that moment, because in fact, one of the reasons we do show up, and it's so, I just want to empathize, it is so prevalent for us to lean into or to default into either or thinking and choices and linear, reductionist thinking where we pull things apart and have to choose between them. And it's, partially perpetuated by the need for certainty and the ways in which we then teach our kids that need for certainty. And so, in our book, look, there's many tools. We talk about it as and I'm so grateful to a community of people that are expanding these ideas, is that we talk about it as a 3-step process, which is change the question, and I can unpack each of these, but very briefly, notice that the questions we are asking are being framed as an either or. Notice that and shift into both and to reframe what's possible and invite us into a different way of thinking. Separate and connect, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier, which is acknowledge and recognize each of the opposing positions that are in that either or, value them, listen to them, engage with them, and use it in service of finding points of connection and then the third is rethinking the outcomes from making a choice and assuming that we're done with the issue to choosing, being in an ongoing dynamic conversation where we acknowledge that we live in systems that are adaptive and changing and complex, and that we make these choices into a more, and we have, and I can unpack these, but we have two different ways of thinking about these choices. One is we either find the win-win out of these points of connections, and we call that the mule, because the mule is this hybrid of the donkey and the horse, or we live into being what we call consistently inconsistent. We see our choice as part of a broader set of choices where overall, over the long term, we're making choices that make these micro shifting, between alternative options, where we're sort of shifting in service of both. And we call that tightrope walking, because essentially the metaphor is that you're moving forward, you're not stalled, but you're never balanced on this narrow tightrope. You're always making these micro shifts, balancing. And so, that might look like, and this really struck me because when I was really interested in issues of corporate social responsibility before I went to grad school, and I always found it
So what is that? Sorry, for those who are that don't understand, what is that?
corporate social responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was interested in how for-profit corporations would adopt and engage with an agenda outside of their bottom line, but things that were addressing, a broader range of issues around their employees, employee welfare, community welfare, planet welfare. And now we name it, at the time it was corporate social responsibility. And now we name it sustainability, or we name it the, strategic development goals, or ESG, or whatever we talk about, to think, that a firm, and we've made this into a politicized term unto itself. So I always, hesitate in the language, because the truth is that political or not political, companies long term have to be able to think about multiple agenda items, because what we see is that any company that just focuses on its bottom line to the detriment of its people, to the detriment of its ethics, to the detriment of its community, they end up like Enron. Like, if you just focus on your bottom line and nothing else matters, then you drive down, Enron being the company that in the late 1990s, 1999 toppled because of ethical collapses, right? And so, so sustainable systems, whether it's a company, whether it have got to focus on these multiple components and think about how they're interdependent. So, yeah. And what I was going to say very briefly is that when I was thinking about this before I went to grad school, I was always mystified by, for a company, anytime a company claimed that they were doing good in the world and then made a decision that was more financially driven, people would decry that the company was no longer doing good in the world. And it struck me that and what we know is that when companies adopt an agenda around a broader social mission, but do not take care of their financial bottom line, that's all nice and good, but they don't have any long-term sustainability. But if they only focus on their bottom line, then they end up like Enron. So it's about living in this tightrope walking, nuanced balance where they have some guardrails that they don't go too far on either end, but that some of their decisions might be more financially driven for their financial solvency. And it's a question of how they sort of keep moving forward. I mean, it's the same thing of our work-life balance. There's rare moments where we find the ideal work-life integration in the moment. But if we're doing this well, we are work-life balancing between these micro decisions of where we're going to spend our time with our families and with our hobbies and where we're going to spend our times on our careers. And we're making those, and we're constantly tweaking those decisions along the way.
Yeah, I like to actually think about, so by the way, how much time do you have left? I don't want to take up too much of your time or anything like that. It
I have
totally
another
depends on you.
30 minutes before I have to be on
Oh,
another
perfect.
call, and I'm great.
Okay, good. So I was just thinking, so the way that I think about it, because it's one thing to sort of think about the longer term goals, but when you're in the day to day, it feels so much like you're wasting your time or wasting resources, or if you think about it, this is the problem that I always think, right? Like, how do you actually build community or get people to do things for the long term? You often have to buy like birthday presents or, have a birthday cake. And if you think about that, strictly speaking, that's a financial disaster to do that, right? Like, you can only give out so many birthday cakes. Um, I know that seems really, you know, um, like too much, but I think that that's ultimately what it comes down to. If even in a family, right? It's always this constant battle of how much should we spend on our kids for a birthday or on our spouse, and it's never really there's never a clear answer. So how do you teach people, because you understand psychology, how do you teach people to be okay with that? Because I think that's a really important part, both at the business level, larger corporation, but then even more practically as a sort of day to day.
Yeah. Whew. I mean, I think it's such a good question. And, I love that your questions actually have this through line of how do you teach kids? How do you teach adults? Probably actually easier to teach the kids than the adults, because once they become adults, they become more entrenched in our thinking. And and I think that key that that you've pointed to and that we point out in our book and in the writings that and by the way, Marianne and I have this wonderful community of scholars, and you know uh, so one of the pieces to navigating these tensions is to be able, there's value in the overarching higher purpose, longer term vision, that being able to recognize, and we don't always know what that vision is exactly, but being able to recognize that we are making decisions in the moment in service of the longer term vision helps us to live into the tensions of the moment, helps us to live into the value of living into the paradoxes of the moment, that we're navigating these tensions. We like to use the metaphor of a boat. If you're on a boat and the waters are choppy, the conventional wisdom, or the wisdom, is look out to the horizon, because that's where you can steady yourself. And I think that that's true. We see this in organizations. My colleagues, Natalie Slowinski and Tima Bansell, did a great study of companies navigating in the Canadian oil sands, navigating ongoing tensions of their financial, very, competitive, very small margin, commodity business of oil and gas, and at the same time being pummeled by environmentalists because it is the dirty, tar sand oil of the oil sands. And the companies that were able to live into the tension between their environmental or their financial needs and adopting environmental practices were the ones that could say, look, this is not a quarterly decision. This is not a decision for the moment. I'm not just making this decision in my family about the cake for the moment. I'm thinking about what is it that this cake is going to have as an impact for the long term, and where do I want to be in the long term, and how does both spending money on this cake but not spending money on the sneakers my kids want, like, how does that sort of create the fabric of living into that complexity for the long term of raising healthy children? Or how does living into that complexity enable us as a company to be a productive, effective company in the long term in the oil sands?
Hmm. So then, a lot of it is. Have you ever encountered anybody that is incapable of sort of making those trade-offs or thinking about the long term? Is that like a behavioral bias? Is that like, is that something that's innate in us, or is there a way that we can create mechanisms to ensure that we make those trade-offs appropriately? Have
Yeah.
you thought about that?
Well, first of all, like, underlying your question is a deep question that we ask in psychology, or, about whether individuals come with a set of preferences and a set of traits, and that they, or they are malleable, nature versus nurture, trait versus state. And I want to, because this is my professional hazard, just acknowledge that too is an either or, and it does not ask the more the deeper question, which I think that psychology starts to ask, but doesn't ask always, which is how do the preferences that we show up with are informed by and molded by the context in which we were in? And how does the context in which we are in help us grow from the preferences? Like, so what is the relationship between trait and state? So I think there too lies an either or question that I would invite us as intellectual, as scholars to reframe into a both and about the relationship between them. So that's one. And I think the other way to answer that is that, so my colleague, Ella Marone Spector, my co-author, Marianne Lewis, our colleagues, Josh Keller and Amy Ingram have worked together on what we call a paradox mindset. We have a paradox mindset inventory. It's free and available online, and people can use it for research, and they have, and they can use it for, teaching, and they have. And, I think part of what we find is that people tend to show up with different levels of preference or facility or capability or comfort with a paradox mindset, which we find is both the experience of tensions that they actually experience. They're in an environment where there are tensions, they see tensions, and their willingness to lean into a both and approach to those tensions. There's diversity on that. And we also find, and this is some of Ella's research, that depending, and Josh's research as well, depending on how you create the context, both Josh's research is at a cultural level and looking across regional differences and cultural differences across geography. And Ella is just has research where she's looked at different teams and the invitation to think about, she changes the question just when you shift the question for people and invite a both and thinking, they're willing to go there, and be more creative as a result. But both of them have research that shows, well, actually there's contextual variables that invite us into this kind of thinking. So I both think there's an open question when it comes to paradox about trait versus state. And I want to, challenge that underlying assumption that it's one or the other and invite us into a question about how our preferences inform the context, and the context informs our preferences, and vice versa.
So I think you're kind of suggesting that managers matter, right? This is essentially what you're coming back to, and I'm thinking at sort of the macro level that managers that help or allow people to have the sort of paradoxical thinking might benefit the organization because they might be more creative. For example, they allow them to think of things in different ways when the environment changes, for example.
Yeah.
So
I was also, very briefly with just a piece of research. My colleague Mariah Besharoff, who's now at Oxford, and she and I have been co-authors together. She had a great study as part of her dissertation where she looked at a natural foods co-op that was committed to both a very strong commitment to organics and the food process and the environmental component, and to at the bottom line. And people would sort of line up on one side or the other of this mission of the food co-op. And what she found is that the people who were in the, more managerial positions, the team leaders, were the ones that were actually able to hold both, because they were able to see across these conflicting places and be able to bring them together. So there's so suggesting that not only do managers matter, but there is something also the opposite, which is to say that perhaps there's something about the value of being able to lean into this approach that is helpful to our careers.
Yeah. So speaking of that, you hold many hats, right? You're doing you're a researcher, an editor, sort of teacher. I guess that's what most people. When somebody asks you what a professor does, they almost inevitably say teacher, right? How are you balancing all of this? I want to sort of get your perspective on how do you manage the career, and how do you reconcile who you are as a person?
Yeah. I was once in a great course that invited us to think about our careers in 5-year chapters of a book, somewhere around there. And I found that to be somewhat true, that my career has unfolded with a stronger focus at different times. So now that I'm a full professor and a chaired professor, I have the opportunity to shift my focus to, or to be able to think more broadly about the impact of my work, about the community, about, but that wasn't true when when I was finishing my PhD and a pre-tenured professor, where the dominant piece that I was thinking about was, how do I get these papers published and how do I get tenure? And and even so now, even as I think more broadly about impact, I'm still thinking about how do I get papers published. And even as I was thinking about how to get papers published, what satisfied my soul was, or what crushed my soul was, gosh, I'm spending all this time trying to get a paper published, and the only person that's going to read it is my mom and my advisor. And my mom won't get past the first paragraph and say, I don't understand what you're talking about. So, even at that
Yeah.
point, I had to be able to clarify I had to be out there teaching and connecting with people and thinking about the value of my research in different ways. Now, it wasn't a ton of my time because I didn't have a ton of time. I needed to keep my focus on these papers. It was enough, though, to remind myself why these papers mattered. And and I that was hard, and that was valuable for me. And being on the other side of this, now if I go too far to the direction of being in conversation with managers and leaders and executives and writing books, and without being in the research, like that's what I bring to this is what I bring to the broader community, is the value of the research. So, I'm constantly sort of rethinking that and renegotiating that balance, and
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
not
How do
easy.
So how do you, so for me, I like to think, I know this is a really crude term, but it's just one thing that I sort of developed in my head. I almost have to give the middle finger to the rest of the world, right? Like I have to have the internal confidence that this is important and I'm just going to walk forward. And no matter what is going on, I have this sort of boundary, right? Like you might have heard of those terms too, right? Like boundaries between your sort of sense of self and the rest of the world. How do you deal with that? Like, what is it? Because we're ultimately dealing with all these multiple um, identities, I guess, or paradoxes, or however you want to say it.
Yeah.
How do we? How would a young scholar deal with this? Or that high school student you're trying to explain this is how you're going to feel when you're in the field and you don't really know what is the right answer. Um, what's your guiding post? What's your North Star? How do you know?
Yeah. My there's so again, there's so much to say, and it's such a good question, and I don't want to be reductionist, and I'm going to reduce it to one word and with two examples, and my one word is community. And here's what I mean by that. Um, in two different ways. The first is that uh, I find that I am often a terrible judge of what to say yes to and what to say no to and where to put my energy. I find that when I do workshops on paradox, people are often really great at figuring out integrative, creative possibilities for other people, and really bad at doing it for themselves. So in both of those cases, I think that reaching out to others to invite them, whether it's mentors and advisors and parents and colleagues, and like getting perspectives outside of ourselves to help us inform these dilemmas that we experience in our lives and switch into paradoxical thinking, and invite the both or just to make decisions and not be so lonely in them, I think is valuable.
Mhm.
And then I guess the second component of community for me is that I mean, if there's anything that I feel deeply proud of in the work that I've done, it was that it was whatever contributions I made to creating a community of scholars studying this idea of paradox in conversation with one another that looked like, you know, conferences, and we tracks at existing conferences and professional development workshops and online webinars and a newsletter and and all of that, and now we have an online conference that now is going to be in its second year with over 100 people tapping in from around the world. And now I am not responsible for all of those, but to the extent that it was like a moment of desperation on my behalf because I felt really lonely as a scholar. And partially, I felt really lonely because, some scholars, I mean, power to the introverts who are who value that time, but I am a total extrovert. And one reason I thought I would never be a good academic is because I just thought I can't sit in front of my computer and talk to myself all the time. I just am not, it's not sustaining for me. And so I started by berating myself and telling myself, therefore, I would be no good. And I shifted into, okay, well, then how do I take that approach and make that my superpower? And I, you know, contributed to, and in some cases launched efforts to foster community among scholars where we could collaboratively support the research so that we could create better ideas and have a better time along the way. And I am so grateful to my colleagues for making this fun and making me a better scholar and making me a better, both a better academic and a better leader. And so, community.
Hmm. I love that. That's one of the things I've been struggling with. So the reciprocity project was kind of born out of that in some sort of way. So I had this idea that I was going to build this platform, make our, writing easier because I really struggle with it. Right? It's not easy, even
No.
if you're an amazing writer. It's not easy. So then I put this out on the internet. Nobody paid attention to it. It's just crickets, right? I'm not sure if you heard of the story. It was total crickets. So then a friend of mine said, "Why don't you go on YouTube?" So I started going on YouTube, and then after some time of doing this a lot, the things that were resonating with people were a lot of what you actually were saying. It's the how do I get people to know that they're normal, that this process is very lonely. But then as well, like how do you get people to feel like they are um, that they're valued, that there's something that's really important about what they're doing because you can't really see it. And this idea of what you're suggesting of just being out and about, I think is such an important thing. And for me, the moment, and you could see me, right? Like I'm screaming at the screen or whatever, right? Those moments of kind of documenting this internal tension that you have of I got to sit here and actually do some writing, and I kind of hate it. But then at the same time, I kind of love it. Right? um, uh, that has been one of the more interesting results I didn't expect from this whole reciprocity project of how other people feel the same thing, but they're often too afraid to speak up. It's almost been this weird. So the way that I think of myself is like, Mr. Rogers at 3 o'clock in the morning, where people are typing on the internet like, well, why is this happening to me? And they'll find some fool is talking about his experiences. So I'm glad I'm not the only one. Is what I'm saying. Is that this is a wonderful story that you're telling me.
How does it
Um,
feel now having done this? What's your reaction, or what are you finding
it's
valuable about it?
again, it feels really. It's like opening up the kimono, right? Like where I am being very much a lot of the so for me, you speak of paradoxical thinking. I'm not sure if a lot of the world actually embraces that, right? So I view almost paradoxes as almost norm violations, right? Where you are doing something that a lot of the world doesn't really understand, right? And talking about this openly, often you get so a ton of stuff, especially on online. People watch 3-second clips and then they make a determination about who you are, and it's almost like we get stuck in terms of what we view about other people. And to me, I'm sort of saying, hey, no, you know, watch more of this, understand what's actually going on, like realize that this is almost like a documentary that's unfolding over many years. Um, and dealing with that has been it's been intense. in a lot of ways, right? Like I, for me, I am, I often feel, and whether this is right or wrong, I don't know. I feel like I'm a complete nobody, and I have to sort of build this platform up, or how do you actually go about of doing this thing? There's not a lot of people sort of demonstrating or talking about it or being open about it. At least people that are, legitimate, I guess, right? Like there's lots of people that are swindling you and telling you do X, Y, and Z, and all of a sudden everything is going to go, gangbusters. Um, there's not a lot of people sort of saying, "Hey, this is the story of what it really means to A, build a platform, and then B, live a life as a academic that's foreign in many different respects, probably, which is what many of us feel."
Ah, David, I'm grateful for the work that you're doing in this space because I think so many people need to hear this.
Yeah, it's intense, right? Like there's a lot of intense moments where you go through where you're thinking, it would be amazing if I can go to my dean or the president of my university and say, "Hey, every single day I know what I'm doing, and every single day this is what I'm supposed to do, and this is my research path." But honestly, I don't know, right? Like
Yeah.
many days, there's a lot of doubts that you go through. I think normalizing those doubts is a good thing,
Yeah.
right? The more that we tell other people that we don't know what we're doing either, I think that is a good thing for everybody to hear. And I think that's sort of this paradoxical thinking of, you know, knowing that you are a good person, no matter what you decide to do, whether it's leaving academia or choosing this career path where you're more of an instructor or you go into administration or any number of possibilities, realizing that you're just a good person no matter what, I think is a is a very positive thing that we need to tell in this field,
Yeah.
in academia in general.
Yeah, and if what I love is if I could go back and tell my younger self anything, it would be um doubt is normal. Doubt is universal. Don't catastrophize the doubt. So how do we acknowledge and value, and I guess that's a question for you. How do you acknowledge and value the doubt as a part of the process and as human, and but not let it take control?
I don't. So that's a really difficult question, and I think to some degree, maybe it's ambiguity that's causing some of this. We don't really understand the world as much as we would understand the world. Um, and I think the roles that we play and the identities that we have, I feel to some way, to some degree, I might be given more forgiveness, for example, because I'm Caucasian male in America. I might be given more forgiveness to do some of these things. So the doubt feels more intense for some other people that might have to live in different worlds. Um, how might you convince somebody that not only the doubt is normal and is perfectly healthy, but how do you convince them to get up and make a contribution, even if it seems really small?
Hmm. I guess I so I've been thinking a lot about what it means to convince other people, and
Love
whether
that.
whether the project that we need to be in the world is convincing other people or inviting them. So, and this comes out of a research project that I'm doing with Natalie Slowinski, and it comes out of thinking about the geopolitics of our world right now and just how much, to your point about polarization, and how much people are just so deeply trying to convince one another when they're not interested in being convinced of anything. So part of where I might sort of invite that question is, how do you invite other people to just rethink their underlying assumptions and be open to alternative possibilities? And I think one way you do that is to start by just inviting people to deepen their own commitment to what they believe. It's like the ironic Viktor Frankl kind of, and I don't know if you know his work on logotherapy, but you prescribe the symptom, right? The idea that like, let's just start with what you are convinced of. And what would it take to and just put a little crack in the armor and invite in curiosity about it? What's it about? Why? Why are you committed to that? What's and then what are the alternatives to your point of view? And what so like what else could be out there? So you believe deeply that great academics are single-brained individuals who sit behind their computer and like pump out brilliant papers at an ongoing rate that like, well, why do you believe that? What does that serve you to believe that? What's the alternative? Where are examples of alternatives? Like just I would be in an invitation of what these assumptions are about.
It's absolutely lovely. It's very intense. Brings up a lot of emotions. Um, that's such a strange thing for me. I bet you. Well, so Natalie knows me. You can say hi to her. We were actually office mates for a few years,
I will.
and yeah. She's wonderful. So one of the things is you have this sort of view of like this is what, and to me, there's a lot of personal journeys that come. And so to me, I was very much this kind of lonely kid in high school, right? Like I was in early on. And so it drove me to become, okay, how do I become perfect? And this is a sort of weird, logic. How do you become perfect? And you become perfect by checkboxing all these things. And then by doing that, then everybody's going to recognize you, and you're going to get fanfare and popularity and all that kind of stuff. And you're going to be the most popular person in high school. Well, I a lot of this journey of reconciling what it means to be, an academic is me coming to terms with some of these sort of deep emotions that have been part of me for a long time. I don't think I'm the only one that has this, right? We have to sort of deconstruct, like, why is it that we view that there's this typical way? And we know most people's lives are not typical, right? Especially if we're going to be more welcoming and open to having people from all walks of life and all different kinds of categories, how they view themselves to come into the profession, right? Especially as we're changing, the economy is changing. We want more people coming in and doing really fun things, and so that means that we need to be more embracing of many different, a plurality of what it means to do work. And it's such a good question, and it brings up so many things of like, why is it that we have this typical way that we view a normal academic should behave, and it's even more tricky in our profession because it's reinforced, right? Where we need to demonstrate that we are somehow worthy to 10 different reviewers, or 5 different reviewers. And how do we demonstrate that we are good enough? So for those of you who are not familiar with it, at different stages of tenure, full professor or getting different accolades, we have to often get maybe 5, 10 people to send letters on your behalf and say that this person is worthy from outside of your field, or outside of your institution. So there's this great deal of pressure, I would say, of demonstrating that you're somehow worthy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of going along a deep path here, but how do you? So there's all this. The career path is very, and you hear a lot of instrumental stuff, right? Like checkbox these kind of things, and this is how you're going to have a wonderful career, and this is how you actually get there. How do you how do you deal with doing things that are, more community based? That seems community based in academia would be considered. I don't know if you should be doing that. That's a kind of a waste of your time. How do you have that confidence?
I, you know, oof. I, I guess what I just want to resonate with in what you're saying, one thing that really struck me having no confidence early on, or having a lot of questions and a lot of doubt and a lot of concerns and a lot of should I be here and a lot of is this the right thing for me and a lot of, like a lot of that is was that for me, I turned that around to say, either I could take that and, as many academics often do, take those fear. Like I kind of had a gut sense that I'm not alone in that. But I also know that a lot of people sort of projected a lot of confidence because of their inner insecurities. And I guess I took a really different path, which was to acknowledge my inner insecurities, to invite other people to be in be in community, be in conversation with one another about them, which actually gave me a lot more confidence. So rather than, so, I'll just say, I mean, I go back to this idea of community. Again, one of the things that I find I'm really proud of and hope we can sustain is that when people come to hang out with this community of paradox scholars, they'll walk away and just say, oh my gosh, like this is so different than what I typically experience in academia. Because we take our insecurities and we just magnify them by, projecting a confidence that's not real and not being vulnerable and not being, being and then challenging other people and saying, assuming that intellectual pursuit is in this like ongoing challenge as opposed to like really being humane and human. And so I feel really proud of being in community that people are supporting each other and being real. And it's not always the case, but that's something I value, which is I find confidence in honoring my insecurities.
I love that. That's very, very intense and very. Uh, I think that's great advice for other people to take going forward. Is to just be okay with themselves. That's
Yeah.
it, right? Like, um, just be who you are, right? So, I guess the last question or the last thing to wrap up here is, what would you have done differently, or what would you tell yourself? And you've already mentioned it. What would you tell yourself 20 years ago? And what would be the key takeaway to become the Wendy Smith of who you are today?
Hmm.
How can you tell other people to, I don't know, follow in your footsteps? I'm not sure if anybody wants to follow these footsteps,
Yeah.
but um, just an important lesson that you've learned about
Hmm.
yourself.
Oof. I mean, earlier, I'll just repeat one thing I said earlier, which is that I would love to tell myself that doubt and uncertainty is real, but not to pathologize it, like use it, like acknowledge it. I would love to remind myself that I do better personally in conversation and in connection with others, and to value that and not hide away from that. Um, I mean, I'm asking the question right now, like, what would my, self 10 years from now want to tell myself now that would invite me into a thinking about growth in a whole new way? And so, I think that we're always growing and changing. And, so how can we live into the value of knowing who we are and valuing that, and inviting ourselves, recognizing, challenging ourselves to keep changing and growing in ways that feel productive. And for me, those ways feel productive when I do it in community. That's not true for everybody, but that is certainly true for me.
Mm-hmm. Or one of the things, and I love that. That's wonderful. But it got me thinking about some advice that I took from one of my mentors, and I've taken this, in the way that I sort of view this experiment is like, this is almost like the reciprocity project is almost like a lab. where I am expressing my doubts and just, being open about them in kind of an experimental way. And so for other people that are having these things, and you have these sort of moments, and I think this is the way that we navigate some of the major crises that we're having in science, is to just express those, write those down, right? If you're going through doubt, talk about the different alternatives, talk about why you're choosing this thing, all those kind of things. That's important moments that we need to be more open about in the scientific field, both as scientists, researchers, but also in our science, in the science that we write or the publications that we write. It's just, we don't know if this is the right answer, but this is the way that we're going to do it under this circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, this was amazing to talk to you. I'm glad I reached out to you. And if there's anything at all, don't be afraid to give me a shout. And I just appreciate, and everybody else appreciates the fact that you're here. It's really wonderful to be with us.
Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing these conversations into the world and inviting people into these reflections. I think they're so important. So, and thank you for the invitation to be part of it. Really grateful.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Mm.
All right. Well, what I can do is just cut